The Neo Geo. Originally released in Japan by SNK Corporation in April of 1990, it would see two cartridge-based forms, an arcade machine that would be dubbed the MVS, and a home variant called the AES. It was a revelation in terms of power and flexibility, giving arcade owners the ability to easily change their Neo Geo machines to the latest and greatest games with no fuss, while providing home console players a visual and audio presentation that absolutely destroyed the other systems of the time. The Neo Geo would see a CD-based system in 1994, simply called the Neo Geo CD. It was SNK's attempt to bring home its awesome arcade library at much cheaper prices. This episode covers the many Neo Geo games that would see a release on the Sega Saturn. Some of these games arrived in great form, while others suffered a bit in the transition. I hope you guys enjoy Neo Geo games on the Sega Saturn. The team-based King of Fighters series would see 3 entries on the Saturn, starting with King of Fighters 95. This is the second entry into the overall King of Fighters releases, and landed on the Saturn in March of 1996. It uses a ROM cartridge to assist in loading game assets. This differs from the standard 1MB and 4MB RAM carts the Saturn had, as these cartridges would need to first store assets from the game disc itself. The ROM cartridge already had these assets stored on it. It ended up being a great port overall, mostly leaving the Neo Geo game intact and very playable. While it didn't change a whole lot from King of Fighters 94, 95 was still a great looking and sounding game, with unique gameplay that was different enough from Capcom's releases to stand on its own. In a rare twist, there would be a PAL European release of this one in July of 1997, complete with the ROM cartridge. King of Fighters 96 would closely follow in December of 1996. This edition would see numerous gameplay and presentational changes, such as new animations and redrawn sprites, as well as expanded evasion and run techniques. The Saturn port is again solid overall, this time taking advantage of the standard 1MB RAM cartridge instead of the dedicated ROM cartridge of the previous game. It also has a full English text option for the story segments, a rarity for games of its time. It would only be available in Japan. King of Fighters 97 would land on the Saturn in March of 1998, again using the 1MB RAM cartridge for the port. It's another solid overall effort. This is my favorite of the King of Fighter games that made its way to the Saturn, and the addition of the advanced and extra play modes allows you to play this one just like King of Fighters 95 or 96. The transitions between the backgrounds offers great variety and tons of new animations. The Saturn captures the majority of this in great form, giving us an A+ experience if you're a fan of the series. Longer load times in between each fight is irritating, but otherwise does nothing to impact this SNK classic. The Saturn would see the first 3 Magical Drop games from Data East, with parts 2 and 3 specifically ported from their Neo Geo releases. These puzzle games are sort of reverse Tetris games, where you must collect orbs that are already on the screen and pair them with light colors. It can be quite frantic and challenging, especially when you first start playing. The heavy use of Japanese text in the mode and options menu can be a hurdle, but otherwise this is a pretty easy game to play. They also tend to be really inexpensive and readily available, and aside from the load times, they're nearly identical to their source material. They aren't going to blow your socks off, but if you like puzzle games, they can definitely have some appeal. In June of 1996, Fatal Fury 3 made its way to the Saturn. Now with 3 fighting planes, air guards, a ranking system that determines who you battle against, and a new combo system, this was a heck of a shakeup in the mainline Fatal Fury games. The animation of the arcade version is heavily edited to fit on the Saturn, as this one does not require the RAM cartridge like most of SNK's other releases. You get copious load times between fights as well, and they are a pain. Still, It's quite playable in this form, and pretty damn cheap, though for a Saturn release, playable likely won't cut it for many of you. It lacks the flash and high-end presentation of some of the other SNK fighters of the era as well, making it one of the Neo Geo's weaker ports. Shortly after Fatal Fury 3 came, Reelbelt Fatal Fury in September of 1996. This introduced a number of big changes from the mainline Fatal Fury games, including ring outs and a revamped punch kick and strong interface. I really enjoyed the graphics of this one, and there are a number of music selections that kick ass too. Load times are again a bit long, but the animation present here is really solid thanks to the use of the 1MB RAM cartridge. You'd need to put it side by side against the Neo Geo original to see any big difference. It also allows you to change the language to English, a nice touch I wish more Japanese fighters would have followed. Showing up over a year later in December of 1997 was the real star of the Fatal Fury Saturn releases, Reelbelt Fatal Fury Special. It reverts the gameplay back to 2 planes and revamps much of the presentation. Using the 1MB RAM cartridge, it's a damn solid representation of the Neo Geo version, and a really good fighting game. The graphical presentation is loaded with little animations and detail throughout, and while the load times are noticeable, they don't ruin the otherwise fine port. Even the English language option makes a return. The Samurai Shodown series showed up in fine form on the Saturn, with Part 3 being released in November of 1996. SNK again uses the 1MB RAM cartridge to bring a very close port home, mostly intact. It changes a number of things from the previous game in the series, including new slash and bust gameplay types that really affect the balance of the characters, as well as a slew of new cast members and artistic changes. The backgrounds here are a little less impressive overall than the second game in the series, but I really like the gameplay variety. It's hard too, and newcomers are likely to be slaughtered until they learn a character fairly well. In October of 1997, Samurai Shodown 4 showed up on the Saturn and was an even better port than the third game. Now with a complete English language option, it has a number of returning and new characters, and even more gameplay tweaks to balance out its excellent combat. The 1MB RAM cartridge is used to bring the majority of the arcade game's animations home intact, and I really enjoyed the music in this one. If you buy just one Samurai Shodown game for your Saturn, make it this one. Under the Curious Releases for the Sega Saturn tab was Samurai Shodown RPG, released in June of 1997. This JRPG was based on the Samurai Shodown universe, though because I do not speak Japanese, my enjoyment of it has been limited at best. It was also released on the Neo Geo CD and PlayStation at the same time, a rare move for SNK. It is yet to see an English fan translation for the Saturn, and although Japanese reviews of the era didn't think much of it, I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't be excited to play an English version of it on the Saturn. The Saturn would also get World Heroes Perfect in August of 1996. This port doesn't need the 1MB RAM cartridge like most of SNK's releases, instead opting to let the base memory in the Saturn do all the work. It succeeds for the most part, giving us an experience similar to the Neo Geo original. I'm not a big fan of this one's gameplay, having preferred SNK's King of Fighter and Samurai Shodown games far more, but fans of the series should find enough here to warrant a look. There are better Neo Geo fighters on Saturn, but this is cheap, doesn't need a RAM cartridge, and is very easy to pick up and play. I'd say curiosity will reward most Saturn owners on this one. Run and gun shooters were not plentiful on the Saturn, So when a port of Metal Slug arrived in April of 1997, there was reason to celebrate. This port of the mega popular Neo Geo series was pretty damn solid on the Saturn too. While there are some animation cuts here and there, it is surprisingly accurate given the fact the game only uses the 1MB RAM cartridge. Load times are decent, with the only glaring weakness being some of the sound elements of the presentation. Seemingly sampled lower and with a harsher end result, a side-by-side clearly shows the original hardware to be superior. It doesn't ruin the experience, however, and the core gameplay is fully intact and as fun as ever. People love to nitpick the hell out of the little differences here and there, but don't let that stop you from enjoying this extremely fun and competent port of one of the Neo Geo's best.
Okay. Thank you. Rocket launcher.
The Stakes Winner games were a series of horse racing games where, as far as I can tell, you can breed and buy horses and race them for money. Random stats appear to control the efficiency of your stable, though the heavy Japanese text definitely makes this one tough for those of us who do not speak the language. There are 2 of these on the Saturn, but I do not recommend them to those who do not read Japanese. If you want to play it in English easily, fire it up on MAME. The Saturn would get one of the Neo Geo's most curious releases in December of 1997, Twinkle Star Sprites. This eclectic mix of genre elements has the look of a puzzle game, the gameplay of a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up, and the counter and reversal systems of a fighting game. You are pitted against an opponent in a one-on-one battle to the death, trying to stay alive and counter each attack with combos of your own. The game is fast and overwhelming at first, but you come to realize pretty quickly how to play, and this one takes on a life all its own. There's little like it on the market even today, and the Saturn port here is fantastically accurate, and even has some tweaks and additions the original did not. If you are looking for something crazy different than what you might be used to on the Saturn, look no further than this. Sunsoft would get in on the Neo Geo ports of its games for the Saturn as well, starting with Galaxy Fight, released in November of 1995. This one was a bit early to use a 1MB RAM cartridge, so the Saturn was on its own for the port. It does a damn fine job though in regards to the animation, missing frames here and there, but keeping a surprising amount in turn. Load times are tolerable and the overall visual polish is remarkably close. If you were a fan of the arcade, this one is close enough to consider, especially if you go with the cheap Japanese version, though it was also available in North America and Europe. Sunsoft would also release Wakuwaku 7 for the Saturn in June of 1997. This one catches a lot of flack in the community for its pixelated backgrounds, load times, and various other problems that would plague the port. The Neo Geo original was definitely better, but even so, I find this game to be a very fun addition to the Saturn's library. It still retains a bunch of the great animations thanks to the use of the 1MB RAM cartridge, has huge character sprites, and the gameplay still captures enough fun to warrant your time. The unique art style alone makes it worth looking at, and if you like quirky characters, you'll find little else on the Saturn to compete with it. Even Sega themselves wanted in on some Neo Geo ports, publishing Fighter's History Dynamite in July of 1997. This fighter originally from Data East is a follow-up to Fighter's History, which was famously sued by Capcom for being so much like Street Fighter II Once Upon a Time. This was known as Karnov's Revenge in the rest of the world, and there is an overseas option that allows you to play it as that version complete with an English story and text. A solid amount of the original game's animation makes a showing here, so if you like the Neo Geo game, you should also like this port. The gameplay itself doesn't have a ton of appeal to me personally, especially its weak point armor system that seems more gimmick than useful strategy, and with so many great fighters on Saturn, this one is really easy to look past. Our last game on the list was released in April of 1997, Ragna Guard. This pre-rendered fighter puts you in mind at times of Killer Instinct, and is one of the few 2D games in the genre to focus heavily on aerial combat. If you've been watching my content long enough, you know I am not a fan of pre-rendered visuals, and this game is butt ugly to my eyes. Fortunately, the gameplay is quite easy to get into and control, making an otherwise underwhelming experience tolerable. Scored cheap, it isn't a bad pickup, especially if you appreciate pre-rendered animation. There we go, Neo Geo on the Sega Saturn. Many of these games can be picked up in a few different packages. King of Fighters 95 and 96 were released together in a double pack. All three King of Fighter games were released together in a best collection, and the two Samurai Shodown games saw a best collection of its own. Many of the games that required the 1MB RAM cartridge saw two types of release: a standalone disc that didn't come with the RAM cart, and a special box pack that came with it. The quality of these ports were overall fairly solid, with the expected cut in animation and sound sample quality. The Saturn was far more powerful than the Neo Geo in terms of processing capability, but simply lacked enough RAM on its own to do the original Neo Geo cartridge-based games one-to-one conversions. Even the Neo Geo CD had far more RAM than the Saturn did. The 1MB RAM cartridge did help mitigate the amount of animation that needed to be cut in those games, but with none of the games taking advantage of the superior 4MB cart, only so much could be done. Games like Samurai Shodown 4 were 378 megabit cartridges, many times larger than the Saturn's RAM. Still, having access to cheap home versions of Neo Geo games was a blessing during the era. AES and MVS carts were still really expensive, and access to Neo Geo CD hardware and software was not widespread. The Saturn versions of these games also tended to destroy their PlayStation counterparts, giving Saturn owners a rare win during that system's otherwise dominant run. With so many inexpensive avenues available to Neo Geo games today, these Saturn editions have become more curiosities and collector's items than anything else. Fortunately, many of them are fairly cheap, some of them have English options, and a few of them are still fun as hell. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.